Before Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson became a headline, a rumor, or a warning whispered across city blocks. Harlem woke up to ordinary things. That ordinary rhythm is what most stories erase. The truth is that life in Harlem during Bumpy Johnson's era did not feel like a constant crime drama. It felt like routine layered with tension, survival mixed with dignity, and community shaped by rules that were never written down but widely understood. To understand Harlem's true heartbeat, it is necessary to begin not with power, but with mourning. As the sun rose over brownstones and tenements, Harlem moved with quiet purpose. Storefronts opened early, church steps filled with conversations that blended faith with practicality. Children walked to school, past men sweeping sidewalks, women opening beauty shops, and vendors setting up crates of fruit. This daily order was not accidental. It existed because chaos was expensive, and Harlem could not afford it. Beneath the surface of ordinary life, there was a structure that kept the neighborhood functioning. And that structure existed long before most outsiders ever learned Bumpy Johnson's name. Bumpy Johnson did not invent this system, but he became its most effective guardian. His influence was not felt as a constant threat, but as an invisible hand guiding equilibrium. Residents did not wake up thinking about him. And that was precisely the point. Stability works best when it goes unnoticed. Harlem's mornings unfolded with a sense that problems would be handled quietly, without drawing outsiders into the neighborhood's internal affairs. Everyday life reflected this balance. Numbers, runners moved discreetly, never interfering with churches or schools. Businesses paid informal fees not as extortion, but as insurance against disruption. Families struggling to pay rent found quiet assistance through channels that did not involve public humiliation. These mechanisms were imperfect and morally complicated, but they functioned within a logic shaped by survival rather than spectacle. The most revealing aspect of Harlem's daily life was how little it resembled the caricature painted by newspapers. There were no constant gunfights echoing through the streets. There was laughter outside barber shops, arguments over card games, and music drifting from apartment windows. The neighborhood carried weight, but it also carried pride. That pride was rooted in self-determination, the belief that Harlem belonged to the people who lived there, not to outside forces looking to extract profit or control. Women played a central role in maintaining this order. Shop owners, church organizers, and household leaders enforced social boundaries more effectively than any enforcer ever could. Gossip was currency. Reputation mattered. A man who harmed his neighbors found doors closing quickly. Harlem policed itself socially long before it relied on anyone with a reputation for violence. Bumpy understood this dynamic and respected it, which is why his power endured. He aligned himself with the neighborhood's existing moral framework, rather than attempting to replace it. Children grew up sensing these invisible rules without being taught them directly. They learned which corners were safe, which adults could be trusted, and which conflicts were better left alone. Life lessons were absorbed through observation, not instruction. This quiet education shaped a generation that understood both caution and resilience. Harlem did not romanticize hardship, but it learned how to endure it. What made everyday life under Bumpy Johnson distinct was not comfort, but continuity. The neighborhood changed slowly, not violently. Businesses stayed open. Churches remained full. Music thrived. Even as poverty and discrimination pressed from every direction, Harlem preserved its internal rhythm. That rhythm was protected by a man whose presence was felt more in what did not happen than in what did. The myth of Bumpy Johnson often focuses on control through fear, but fear alone does not sustain communities. Harlem survived because order was maintained without constant disruption. That order allowed people to live, plan, and hope within constrained circumstances. It allowed daily life to feel normal enough that children could dream beyond their blocks. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told. Not the legend, not the violence, but the quiet mornings when Harlem belonged to itself. Those mornings were the foundation upon which everything else stood. And they existed because someone understood that power was meaningless if it destroyed the very community it claimed to protect. As the day moved toward night, The same streets that felt ordinary in the morning transformed into something far more complex, revealing how Harlem's calm depended on unseen negotiations that most residents never realized were happening at all. By the time Harlem reached its afternoons, the neighborhood revealed the machinery that kept its mornings possible. This was the hour when everyday life intersected most clearly with the unseen order that governed the streets. Work replaced ritual, movement replaced stillness, and decisions made quietly behind counters and stoops shaped how safely the evening would arrive. To outsiders, these hours looked ordinary. To those who lived there, afternoons were when Harlem proved whether its balance could hold. Shops became the center of gravity. Grocery stores extended credit without paperwork. Tailors adjusted payments without judgment. Barbershops doubled as information hubs, places where news traveled faster than any newspaper and where reputations were refined or ruined through casual conversation. These businesses were not merely commercial spaces. They were anchors. Their survival depended on predictability, and predictability depended on rules that everyone understood but rarely discussed openly. Bumpy Johnson's influence surfaced here not as intimidation, but as consistency. Merchants knew that disputes would be settled quietly, rather than violently. They understood that outsiders attempting to disrupt local commerce would be discouraged long before damage occurred. This allowed Harlem's economy to function in ways that formal institutions often failed to support. Banks denied loans. Insurance companies avoided the neighborhood. So Harlem built its own safety nets, informal and fragile, yet effective enough to sustain daily life. What outsiders rarely grasped was how discipline operated socially rather than violently. A shopkeeper who cheated customers found suppliers reluctant to restock. A man who caused trouble discovered invitations quietly withdrawn. Harlem punished disruption through isolation before escalation. Bumpy Johnson understood this instinctively. His strength came from aligning with it rather than overriding it. Children felt this order without understanding it. Afternoons meant supervised play, trusted neighbors watching from windows, and adults correcting behavior before it hardened into something dangerous. Community involvement compensated for the absence of institutional protection. Harlem did not outsource responsibility easily because experience had taught it the cost of neglect. Bumpy Johnson's role in this environment was subtle but decisive. He discouraged unnecessary attention. He understood that visibility invited interference, and interference destabilized the very systems that kept Harlem functional. His reputation served as a deterrent to reckless behavior, more effectively than direct enforcement ever could. People behaved responsibly not because they feared immediate punishment, but because they feared losing equilibrium. Afternoons exposed the contradiction at the heart of Harlem's reality. The neighborhood thrived not because it was free of crime, but because crime operated within limits shaped by community survival. Those limits were fragile and imperfect, but they allowed life to continue with a degree of dignity. Bumpy Johnson did not create that dignity, but he protected the space in which it could exist. As the sun dipped lower, tensions began to surface. Decisions made during the afternoon determined whether night would arrive quietly or violently. Harlem understood this transition well. It was the moment when unseen negotiations reached conclusions and when the cost of miscalculation became highest. The calm of the afternoon was deceptive. It was not peace. It was preparation. And beneath the hum of everyday labor, forces were aligning that would soon test how strong Harlem's unwritten rules truly were. When evening shadows stretched across the same streets that had functioned smoothly all day, Harlem's balance faced its greatest challenge, revealing what happened when unwritten rules were pushed to their breaking point. As Harlem moved from afternoon into evening, the neighborhood entered its most delicate phase. This was the hour when everything that had been protected all day faced its first real test. Stores closed their doors, churches emptied, children were called inside, and adults measured the air instinctively. Evening was not dangerous by default, but it was revealing. It exposed whether the unwritten rules had held, or whether cracks had formed beneath the surface. Bumpy Johnson's influence became most visible at this hour, precisely because it remained unseen. Evenings demanded restraint more than authority. Reckless behavior attracted attention from outsiders, and outsiders were the greatest threat to Harlem's autonomy. The goal was not to eliminate danger, but to contain it before it spilled into chaos. That containment depended on discipline, operating quietly. Nightlife began carefully. Clubs opened their doors with selective patience. Music spilled into the streets, but volume remained controlled. Owners understood that excess invited scrutiny. Performers understood that the stage was both sanctuary and spotlight. Harlem's culture thrived at night, but it did so with boundaries that protected its survival. Informal negotiations, often concluded during these hours. Disputes that had simmered throughout the day reached resolution before darkness fully settled. This was intentional. Problems left unresolved overnight had a way of growing teeth. Bumpy Johnson encouraged this rhythm not through commands, but through expectation. Conflicts that escalated after dark risked destabilizing entire blocks. That risk was unacceptable. The neighborhood's understanding of protection was complex. It was not about force standing openly on corners. It was about deterrence through predictability. People knew which behaviors would invite consequences and which would be ignored. That clarity reduced impulsive decisions. Harlem valued foresight because hindsight was always too expensive. Evenings also revealed Harlem's vulnerability. Outsiders tested limits when daylight faded. Small-time opportunists mistook calm for weakness. Some attempted to exploit the transition, believing night erased accountability. They learned quickly that it did not. Harlem responded not with spectacle, but with precision. Disruptions were addressed quietly, often before they drew attention beyond the block. Bumpy Johnson's reputation operated most effectively at this time. It hovered like an unspoken reminder that recklessness carried weight beyond immediate confrontation. The neighborhood did not need him present. His absence was enough. People adjusted behavior based on what they believed might happen, not on what they could see happening. Families played a role in this evening order as well. Mothers enforced curfews. Elders discouraged unnecessary wandering. Community responsibility tightened naturally as darkness fell. Harlem did not romanticize night. It respected it. That respect preserved life. Police activity intensified during these hours, often disrupting rather than supporting stability. Patrols increased. Stops became frequent. Officers interpreted gatherings as threats, unaware that those gatherings were often the glue holding neighborhoods together. This misunderstanding heightened tension, but Harlem responded with restraint. Survival depended on avoiding escalation. What made evenings particularly fragile was the accumulation of decisions made earlier in the day. A business dispute left unresolved, a debt unpaid, a boundary crossed casually. Evening magnified these issues. Harlem's ability to function depended on how many of them had been addressed quietly before nightfall. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone. He focused on prevention rather than reaction. He discouraged behavior that would force his hand. His greatest success was not the conflicts he resolved, but the ones that never happened. Evening calm was not accidental, it was earned daily. As night deepened, Harlem revealed its true complexity. It was not a place balanced on violence, but on discipline. That discipline was invisible, uncelebrated, and fragile. It existed because enough people believed in preserving their community more than asserting dominance. But belief alone was never enough forever. Evenings also carried the seeds of change. Pressure from outside forces grew steadily. Federal attention, economic strain, and generational shifts tested Harlem's internal systems. What worked quietly for years could unravel quickly under sustained scrutiny. Bumpy Johnson sensed this tension long before it became obvious. The evenings felt heavier. The calm required more effort to maintain. By the time true night arrived, Harlem stood at a crossroads between preservation and exposure. The same mechanisms that kept the neighborhood stable also made it vulnerable to misunderstanding and interference. Evening revealed whether the balance could endure another day. And while the streets settled into darkness, unseen forces beyond Harlem were preparing moves that would challenge every unwritten rule the community relied on. As midnight approached, Harlem's carefully maintained balance faced pressure not from within, but from outside eyes that no longer intended to look away, threatening to expose a system that had survived precisely because it stayed unseen. Midnight was never just a time in Harlem. It was a threshold, a moment when everything that had been managed quietly throughout the day either held together or unraveled completely. By midnight, the neighborhood no longer belonged only to its residents. It shared space with outsiders who did not understand its rhythms, did not respect its limits, and did not care how fragile its balance truly was. This was the hour when federal eyes began to linger longer than usual. For years, Harlem's stability had been misread as something temporary, even suspicious. Outsiders assumed calm meant weakness or corruption. They failed to see the discipline beneath it. Midnight became the moment when those assumptions hardened into intent. Investigators, journalists, and distant decision-makers began treating Harlem not as a living community, but as a problem waiting to be solved. Under Bumpy Johnson's influence, midnight had once been controlled, without spectacle. Clubs closed on time, streets thinned gradually. Problems were resolved before they became headlines. But as outside attention increased, the cost of discretion rose sharply. Every decision carried risk. Every movement could be misinterpreted. Harlem was being watched by people who did not know what they were seeing. The pressure was not obvious at first. It arrived through patterns. Increased patrols, unmarked cars lingering too long, questions asked in the wrong places. Men who did not belong standing where locals noticed immediately. Harlem sensed this shift instinctively. Communities always do. When observation replaces neglect, danger follows. Bumpy Johnson understood that midnight scrutiny was the most dangerous kind. Daylight enforcement came with rules and optics. Midnight enforcement came with improvisation. Mistakes made after dark carried permanent consequences. One misjudged raid, one misunderstood gathering, one aggressive response could shatter the balance Harlem relied on to survive. What made this moment especially volatile was how little control Harlem actually had over the narrative being formed. Outsiders saw fragments and filled gaps with imagination. A quiet block became controlled territory. A disciplined night became criminal dominance. Harlem's internal order was being rebranded as conspiracy, and that rebranding justified intrusion. Bumpy Johnson's role during these hours became increasingly constrained. His presence, once a stabilizing symbol, now attracted scrutiny simply by existing. Doing nothing could be interpreted as guilt. Doing something could be interpreted as confirmation. The margin for error vanished. Midnight turned strategy into survival. The true danger of this period was not raids or arrests. It was erosion. The slow breakdown of community confidence. The sense that Harlem's internal solutions were no longer enough. When people begin to doubt the systems that protect them, they either withdraw or overreact. Both outcomes invite chaos. This clash of perspectives placed Bumpy Johnson in an impossible position. Protecting Harlem meant preserving discretion. Preserving discretion meant resisting engagement. Resisting engagement made him appear more powerful, not less. Midnight magnified this paradox relentlessly. Behind closed doors, far from Harlem, decisions were forming based on these misinterpretations. Strategies that did not account for community dynamics. Policies designed around numbers rather than people. Midnight intelligence briefings reduced Harlem to a set of risks instead of a living system. Harlem could feel the approach of something irreversible. The night air carried tension heavier than usual. The sense that unseen decisions were being made elsewhere, by people who would never walk these streets, never understand the cost of disruption. Midnight was no longer just a test of Harlem's internal balance. It was a countdown. And as the clock moved closer to dawn, it became clear that the greatest threat to Harlem was not violence, rivalry, or crime, but exposure to a system that mistook quiet survival for defiance. What Harlem did not yet realize was that the decisions forming at midnight would soon arrive in broad daylight, forcing the neighborhood to confront a final question: could its true heartbeat survive once the world refused to look away? When the noise finally faded and the myth of control loosened its grip, Harlem did not collapse the way outsiders expected. There were no immediate flames, no sudden descent into chaos. No dramatic unraveling that confirmed the worst fears of those watching from a distance. Instead, something quieter and far more revealing happened. Harlem continued to wake up. Stores opened. Children went to school. Churches filled. Music played. The absence of Bumpy Johnson did not erase the systems that had sustained everyday life. It tested whether those systems had ever truly belonged to one man at all. This was the moment history rarely pauses to examine. Stories tend to end with power falling, arrests being made, or legends dying. But real communities do not end when a central figure disappears. They adapt, sometimes painfully, sometimes imperfectly, but always with memory guiding survival. Harlem's true heartbeat emerged most clearly after the myth stepped aside. The first noticeable change was uncertainty. The invisible order that once relied on reputation now relied on memory. People asked quieter questions. Would the unwritten rules still matter without enforcement? Would outsiders push harder now that the symbol of restraint was gone? Would the neighborhood fracture without a single figure representing balance? These questions did not erupt into panic. They lingered, shaping decisions carefully. What followed was not anarchy, but negotiation. Community leaders, business owners, church figures, and families leaned into the same social discipline that had always existed. Harlem discovered something unsettling and empowering at the same time. Bumpy Johnson had protected the space, but the space had also protected itself. The routines, boundaries, and expectations did not vanish with him because they were never owned by him alone. This realization changed how Harlem saw its own past. The legend of a mob boss maintaining order gave way to a deeper truth. Order had survived because people believed in preserving their neighborhood more than exploiting it. Bumpy had understood this instinct and aligned with it, but he had not created it. That distinction mattered now more than ever. External pressure did not disappear. If anything, it intensified. Law enforcement filled the vacuum aggressively, assuming absence meant opportunity. The misinterpretation continued. Harlem responded the same way it always had, with adaptation, with restraint, with quiet recalibration rather than open defiance. The heartbeat slowed, but it did not stop. Bumpy Johnson's legacy became complicated in retrospect. He was remembered not just as a figure of control, but as a reflection of Harlem's need for self-determination in a world that offered little protection. His presence had allowed everyday life to function without constant interference. His absence forced Harlem to confront whether it could protect itself without relying on a singular myth. In the end, Harlem's untouched truth was not about dominance or fear. It was about people navigating limited choices with dignity. It was about survival shaped by community rather than control. Bumpy Johnson's era did not define Harlem. It revealed it. The real cinematic moment is not the rise or fall of a powerful figure. It is what remains after the noise fades. Harlem remained, and that endurance speaks louder than any myth ever could. This is why these stories matter. Not to glorify power, but to understand what lives beneath it. Harlem's true heartbeat was never owned by a mob boss. It belonged to the people who woke up every morning and chose to keep going. If one man's shadow could shape an entire neighborhood's survival, what other untold forces have quietly protected communities history chose to misunderstand? And what happens when those forces are finally stripped away?